This is the story of how my friends and I decided to each make a pact with a demon and the resulting consequences. Synchronicities. It's a bit slow to start as it requires a bit of background, so bear with me. This happened about 4 to 5 years ago. I'm fairly confident in my memory of the events, but some parts are hazy, which I'll explain why later on. By the way, I refuse to green text because reasons. So anyways, I'm at my friend's house. I'm hanging out with 3 of my friends and 2 other people that I knew but didn't really associate with. They're good people, but having more than 3 friends is exhausting, and I honestly don't care enough to maintain that many relationships. I say this because I kind of disregard their existence during this event. To avoid confusion, my friends will henceforth be known as Hatchet, Colt, and Paul because reasons. A little background on each of them and what our circle had been doing recently is necessary for this story. Paul was a born and bred Christian. At this time he was fervent in his belief but had started to waver upon us becoming friends, though it's possible it started beforehand. I only really noticed it after this event. He is by no means close-minded. He was our group's straight man. At this point we had been friends for about 6 months. He had been friends with Colt and Hatchet for much longer. Colt was agnostic and the embodiment of the pothead stereotype. He was our funny man. I've known him for most of my life. Hatchet was an atheist and deeply opinionated. He was also a bit of an edgelord. He was the raver of the group and the guy with all the connections for psychedelics. At this point in time, the 4 of us had been experimenting with psychedelics heavily at Colt's house on a weekly basis. Our favorite thing to do was to try to scare ourselves into tripping harder. We all believed that Colt's house was haunted long before we started experimenting with psychedelics. For various reasons, we also believed the focal point of this haunting was his garage, where we always hung out, the night prior to the event I'm going to be talking about. Eventually, Hatchet had brought Ouija board over for shits and giggles. Long story short, nothing really happened. We experienced the usual things that led us to believe the house was haunted, but nothing more happened. So he ended up carving the first letter of each of our names out of the board, pouring wax onto it, burning it in various places, carving a message into the back of it, then leaving it on some random person's doorstep a few streets down. Basically, we were a group of stupid assholes. So with that out of the way, the next night we decided we were all going to trip on mescaline again, hence why my memory is hazy at parts, and try to incite some sort of paranormal event. We took it early in the afternoon so we would peak throughout the night. As the night wore on and we passed midnight, we were running out of things to do and our usual games were losing their punch. So I, having recently read The Lesser Key of Solomon and having it on hand in PDF form, suggested that we try something new. I suggested to my friends that they suspend their disbelief and we try performing a ritual, that we sell our souls. We had tried so many different things and had nothing to show for it besides some unexplainable noises and spooky phenomenon. I explained to them that thinking of this as the cartoonized version of magic was wrong, that it's possible that performing these rituals, instead of summoning a stereotypical horned and winged demon and getting our heart's desire, was actually a way to hone our senses and our minds to contact something ancient and powerful. Not necessarily demons or gods, but something beyond human understanding, especially with our perception of the veil between our realm and the next being made permeable by the mescaline. Hatchet joined me in convincing the others, saying that we had nothing to lose. Most of us didn't even believe the soul existed. That if this didn't work it was just another win for atheism. If it did work, we had everything to gain. Paul almost immediately said no. As expected, Hatchet was in. The second I suggested selling our souls, Cole took a little convincing, hence the above paragraph. I was satisfied, as I believe in the power of threes, so we set about browsing the web and researching what exactly our rituals would consist of, figuring out who we each wanted to contact, determining what exactly we wanted, and gathering what we would need to perform said rituals. We each ended up cobbling together a mix of different rituals from a wealth of different sources. As it was rather difficult to stay focused on mescaline, I don't exactly remember what Colt and Hatchet chose, except that Hatchet wanted to summon the demon that starred in The Exorcist. Apparently he found legit information regarding the demon from the movie. Bonus points because the location of The Exorcist was just a short drive away. Colt's choice involved something to do with lust and being desirable. I chose Paimon and knowledge. It took roughly about 2 hours to do research and gather what we needed. We tried to rush because we wanted to begin at 3 a.m. sharp. I don't really remember the specifics of the different rituals we performed except for the fact that they all involved an invocation, some blood, some fire, and meditation. I do remember that none of our rituals were exactly kosher. They didn't adhere to any sort of standard set out in a grimoire, rather they were a combination of many. As I said before, we kind of cobbled them together in a rush. I personally didn't think the specifics mattered much, as long as it had a few basic elements. Everyone treated me as an expert on the subject even though I was relatively new to that side of the occult myself, so my affirmation was enough to go off of law. Those being the invocation, blood, candles, incense, and burning a written invocation with blood on it. So we turned the lights off in the garage and then set about performing our rituals separately and simultaneously, while Paul and the 2 others watched in a mixture of awe and horror. By this time, I had already forgotten the other 2 existed. One of them actually ended up leaving once they realized we were serious. She didn't believe in ghosts but she believed in demons and was super Christian. I never understood that logic, so don't ask me. Side note. She was also my girlfriend at the time. Our relationship ended at that moment. She didn't say another word to me until years later. I forgot that she was one of the people there, until now. She wasn't important then or to the story now, though. The other girl ended up staying for the duration of the ritual. Her and Paul had a thing, I think. I'm not sure. Also unimportant to the story. So we finished our rituals simultaneously, by cutting ourselves, applying it to the invocation, and burning it. We stupidly did this with the garage door closed, much to everyone's dissatisfaction. Once we completed the ritual we simultaneously began meditating. I fully expected to have intense hallucinations by this point. I had none. I saw nothing but darkness, which is to be expected when you close your eyes and meditate, except for the whole tripping on mescaline bit. The longer I meditated the more drained I felt both physically and mentally. I stated my intentions to that darkness. I offered 3 vessels in exchange for knowledge and understanding of everything, and I expressed that I desired something that I can't explain in words. It was a feeling that I imparted to the darkness. It was vague, but at the time I felt that if souls did exist, 3 of them had to be worth at least a world's worth of knowledge. I didn't want just what I could read in books or learn on my own. I wanted everything. I waited for a long time for some sort of answer or sign, even some sort of hallucination. Nothing came. There was only that darkness. So after an indeterminate amount of time I opened my eyes. We all did, simultaneously. I didn't think much of it at the time, but that was the beginning of many weird and unexplainable things to come in the following days. Both Colt and Hatchet both said they had the same experience as me, the same darkness, the same exhaustion. Paul was relieved by the fact that he hadn't been eviscerated by a demon, though this experience made him seriously start questioning his faith. I think it was partly because he wasn't eviscerated by a demon. Haha. We were all a bit unsatisfied with the results and extremely exhausted. Despite being only about halfway through a mescaline trip, I was ready to go to sleep and felt like I had already come down. So we all decided that was it for the night and decided to head to our respective homes. I hitched a ride with Paul and the girl that stayed, back to my house. I only lived a mile down the road, so I typically walked to and from Colt's house, and I was too exhausted to make the trek back to my house in the dark on a back road. I remember Paul and the girl talking to me about what had happened, but I don't remember any of what was said. I do remember that the girl didn't know how to keep her mouth shut and told everyone she knew what we did. Colt's house subsequently became known as the Hell House, and people tended to shy away from me after that. Thanks to social media and living in a small town, rural area, people became aware of who we were. Despite my best efforts to keep to myself and not associate with the majority of people in the area. So anyways, I got back to my house and immediately something was off. There was a bright pale blue light on in a room of my house that had no lights in it, at a time when no one at my house would have been awake. The only lights on in my house were the lights that are built into the outlets to illuminate the floor at night, and those are only in the hallways. I immediately thought it was a flashlight and that someone had gotten into my house. So I asked Paul to come with me. as he was big into boxing and I figured that was better than going it alone. The most experience I have with combat is a single year of taekwondo. Read, none. I was already exhausted, and all my guns were inside. We both started approaching my front door by walking through the front yard. We moved as quietly as possible, yet the second my foot touched the first step on my front porch, the light turned off. Our gaze was immediately drawn to the front door, which was located next to the room that was lit up. As a shadow passed across it, my front door has a large pane of glass in it, through which you can see the tiny pale light of one of the hall outlets. Paul immediately noped the fuck out. I had no choice but to suck it up and head inside, as it looked like someone was walking around my house and my family was asleep upstairs. Needless to say, upon searching my house, no one was there that shouldn't have been there and my family was all asleep. Later that day, after getting my 8 hours and enjoying my usual lucid flying dreams, I decided I was going to walk back to Colt's. I spent a lot of time at his house. There wasn't exactly much to do in this area, unless you like bowling, so I set out. It was always an enjoyable walk. There was lots of scenery on the way, as the road cut through forest and some old-ass farmland. The road was also dotted with about a handful of abandoned homes, all of which were at least a century old, some of which stretched all the way back to the plantation days. So it was always a beautiful stroll with lots to see. About midway, instead of looking at all the beautiful scenery, I was looking at the ground as I walked on the side of the road. Almost immediately I found 2 $20 bills neatly folded and held down by a piece of gravel, which alone wouldn't have been that big of a deal. I've found cash before, though never that much. So I decided I was gonna hit up Dudeman and get some weed, hash, and LSD. I figured it wasn't a waste of money since I found it, so why not? Later on, as I met with Dudeman, he ended up accidentally giving me double of what I asked for because he was drunk. When I tried to hit him up to tell him what happened, his phone was disconnected, even though I had just gotten a hold of him an hour beforehand. Needless to say, the circle conveyed and enjoyed the fruits of my eternal damnation. That trip itself was incredibly enriching and was one of the best experiences of my life. It completely changed my current outlook on life and led to a long chain of events spanning a couple years. I was granted knowledge and understanding almost immediately. I believe I have only continued to grow and learn from my relationship with Paimon since then, though it's nothing I can concretely tie to the ritual. Like this, my friends weren't so lucky. Within a week of the ritual, Hatchet would earn his namesake. He ended up getting into an altercation over some weed at my neighbor's house with the owner of the house. We'll call him Carl. Carl was trying to screw Hatchet over. Hatchet pulled a knife and started getting big with Carl. Carl initially backed off and went inside. Before Hatchet could leave, Carl ripped open his front door screaming Hatchet's name with a butcher knife in hand. When Hatchet turned around, Carl threw the butcher knife at Hatchet from across the yard. Somehow, this butcher knife spun perfectly and cracked Hatchet in the side of his head. It split his face open from his cheekbone below his left eye to the top of his left ear, completely severing the muscles and tendons. Hatchet nearly bled out right there, though he managed to survive somehow. According to his doctor, if he wouldn't have ducked when he did, the butcher knife would have hit his throat and he would have died on the spot. Now, Carl is by no means some professional knife thrower or anything of the sort. He had never thrown a knife with any success before as long as I'd known him, let alone a damn butcher knife. Sideways, outside of once dicking around with some throwing knives I own, he did not practice either. It was just a lucky throw. Hatchet has continued to have rather bad luck following this event. I don't want to delve too deep into his personal business, so I won't go into detail. As for Colt, within that month, his father passed away from what was basically a paper cut. The police and medics that arrived on the scene said it seemed that due to the combination of medications he was on, blood thinners, pain meds, etc., he failed to notice that he was bleeding profusely and ended up dozing off from the loss of blood. He bled out in his sleep. As for Paul, he eventually succumbed to peer pressure and performed the ritual himself, in the garage at Colt's house as Colt and myself watched. Hatchet had drifted away from our circle, and I thought that it was best to have 3 people that had performed the ritual within our circle. At this time Paul had completely turned his back on Christianity and took what he was doing very seriously and carefully decided on what he wanted and who he would invoke. I think that because he took it seriously and respected what he was doing, he didn't experience what Hatchet and Cole did. Though he kind of treated it like a child and their birthday wish, he didn't tell us what he wanted or who he invoked. Paul has had relatively good luck to this day, though there is no obvious synchronicity that I am aware of related to his ritual, besides him saying that he experienced the same darkness and exhaustion, though that could easily be chalked up to bias from us expressing our experiences. Since all that happened, I walked away from psychedelics and weed about a year or so after the ritual. I was diagnosed with cancer at the young age of 22. I went to the doctors for chest pains and came out with testicular cancer. Haha. That was actually one of the best things to happen to me though. Not only did the cancer kill itself before it had a chance to spread elsewhere by cutting off its own blood supply, which is pretty unheard of, that event completely changed my life for the better. I can't tie that directly to the ritual. It just seems pretty damn miraculous to me. So, I may not have been forthcoming in my original post. I do understand why there would be prejudice against demons. I just wanted to hear X's opinions on the subject. Also, I apologize if there is any inconsistencies in the story. I've been typing this up for about 2 hours because I thought it would only take 30 minutes and then didn't want to just give up. I've been up since 4 p.m. yesterday and it's 9:30 a.m. now. I also worked for 10 hours in 100-degree weather. So yeah, I'm a bit exhausted. Feel free to ask me about any part of the story, or any questions in general. I'll try to answer to the best of my ability and clear up any inconsistencies, if any actually even cares enough to read all that shit. Haha, that's just one of dozens of paranormal related stories I have.